Well, hello. Welcome to another edition of On the Edge. I'm your host, Peter Asmus, Director of Strategic Marketing at AutoGrid. And today I'm happy to say we have Jarrett Leader, Senior Director Resilience from the Smart Energy Power Alliance.
Hey
Welcome,
there.
Jarrett.
How's it
Yeah,
going, Peter? Thanks for having me on today.
it's going pretty good. As I was saying, we've had some wildfire smoke, but the wind has blown it out. So I'm feeling like hopefully get some decent weather coming here. So, just to start with, Jared, my journey into the energy world, I always say don't follow my path
Mhm.
because I wasn't. I was more of a journalist and kind of fell into energy by accident, but I don't think that's probably your story. So, how did you get into this energy world? Like, how did you get to SEPA?
Yeah, sure. So my energy journey is quite interesting. I started as an engineer working with municipal and utility clients. Uh, I was on the civil engineering side, so we were working with wastewater treatment plants and water infrastructure. And one thing that always attracted me, Peter, was the nexus between water and energy. And all
Right.
of these water systems, the pumping, the treatment, the facilities had an energy component. And the company I was working with at the time started to do some work, and more municipal clients were asking about renewable energy sources, things like waste to heat generation, landfill gas recovery. And that was my kind of soiree into the renewable energy space. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it, and I really wanted to do it more at a larger scale. And that's when I found the organization SEPA that I'm currently working with. And for the past 6 years, I've been with SEPA.
Yes. Now, SEPA, I remember, kind of evolved from a variety of organizations. You probably know better than I because I think there was like a solar energy organization, there was a demand response organization, or there was some sort of, combination. So maybe just trace that little history because I guess that's kind of interesting for me at least. Like, how did this
Sure.
organization come together or evolve? I guess.
So I'll go back to 2016. It goes back further, but just for the sake of time and our audience, we can just start at
Okay,
2016. At
sounds
that
good.
time, it was the Solar Electric Power Association. I
Okay,
actually joined just a year or so after that.
okay,
But in 2016, the Solar Energy Power Association expanded the mission to SEPA, the Smart Electric Power Lines.
okay.
And why did we do that? Our board asked us to. We loved what we were doing with solar, and the board came to us and said, "Well, can you expand to think more holistically, to think about kind of the entire clean energy ecosystem?" SEPA is a non for profit 501(c)(3), a membership organization, and it's been that way from the very beginning. Um,
Hmm.
what does that mean? We don't lobby. We don't take positions on issues. What we try to do is gain consensus among all stakeholders to accelerate the progress of clean energy and carbon free energy. So, our roots, yes, have always been in solar, and we expanded several years ago because we saw the need. Our members asked, the questions around distribution grid needs and grid modernization and energy storage. So we kind of completed the ecosystem of the clean energy ecosystem, and that's why we expanded our focus, and we continue to do that at SEPA. We are continuously looking into where the industry is going, um, starting in solar and moving on into other technologies. We can talk a little bit more about those. But in 2024, we've got this new vision, and our priorities are emerging technologies, resilience, energy storage, transportation, and policy. So those are our five focus areas, and why we pick those. Really, the decisions and investments and the energy system are made within those five topic areas, really. And that's where we saw we want to focus on working with the industry to ensure kind of the speed and success to facilitate that over. And I'll note this. RE Plus, it's just around the corner. SEPA is a co-owner of RE Plus, and the show has followed a similar trajectory that we have, starting from kind of Solar Power International, if you recall, Peter, back in I
Right.
would say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, to
Yep.
North America Smart Energy Week, now to RE Plus. So SEPA did it first, and then the show followed suit.
Okay. Now, I remember I went to one of your events in DC, and God, it could have been 10 years ago. I don't remember exactly one, but I remember there was also a lot of demand response providers there as well. And I think, so I believe your vision of clean energy, obviously, you personally started with more like even waste to energy. Is it the entire spectrum? I mean, clean energy, most people think of renewables, but there's things like fuel cells. There's demand response, for example, energy efficiency. Is SEPA kind? You mentioned, I guess, your five new focus areas, but what's your vision of clean energy? Is it that? Is it broad? Is it keep getting broader, or what's
Yeah,
your
no,
view?
it's a good question. And we've had conversations with our board around the terminology between carbon free and net zero and
Right.
clean technology. But really, we have some of those, those statements in our mission. We went with carbon free.
Okay.
We are currently focused on solar PV, both from a community solar scale all the way to green tariffs and utility scale. We are looking. We have a working group in energy storage, so we do have a focus in energy storage, and it's one of our five focus areas. It's kind of neat. We've started to do. My colleague Cynthia has started to do some education series, and clean hydrogen, green hydrogen is one of those. And
Okay.
while I'm still trying to figure out the different colors of hydrogen and where
That's
we're focused on, but that's the
right.
emerging technology, focus area. We do see a need to stay flexible and preserve the flexibility as an organization to move into different directions. And that emerging tech space, currently it's involving, AI technology on the distribution system, for example. We've started to look at offshore wind and clean hydrogen as ways, fuel cells as ways to um, get to 100% carbon free. It's not a one size fits all. And I think at this point, we're all in agreement of that. Now, which direction it goes, which technology prevails, at this point, we want to keep our options open and preserve the flexibility. We've always been a kind of a technology agnostic organization.
Yeah, though, no, that's pretty wise. So, of course, I know that a lot of constituency is utilities. And of course, utilities are under a lot of pressure these days. There's the decarbonization, some of that regulatory, some of that investors now paying more attention, extreme weather events, new suppliers coming into the mix as some markets are deregulated. In your view, are the majority of utilities starting to shift their strategies on the whole in the U.S.? I know that there have been some who've some might say, put their head in the sand or dug in their heels. But my sense is more and more utilities are realizing the world is changing and they do have to go in a new direction. I'm just curious, do you see that?
Yeah,
Is that valid,
yeah.
validated by what you're seeing?
The world is changing, and the effects of climate change and are real, and not only utilities but all the stakeholders and constituencies that we're working with are starting to see that. I can tell you that the majority of utilities that I talk to and work with are definitely doing that. They're coming to SEPA to define what the journey looks like for them. The utilities we work with, I can say, also understand that this process gets more collaborative and more complex every single year. Historically, I think the utility space has focused on the three core tenets, right? The reliability of the grid, the safety, and the affordability. In recent years, sustainability has become a main driving force in financial reporting and sustainability reporting at utilities. And the utilities that are coming to SEPA are finding ways to reach those carbon reduction strategies, whether it's working with key account customers on long-term renewable deals, whether it's investing or divesting. We're starting to see that happen at a corporate level, but also kind of trickle down to utility operations, planning, and even customer programs. So that's one example. The collaborative nature of it also has evolved. Things like stakeholder engagement, involving community based organizations, that's a new thing for utilities. Traditionally, the engagement has been with the customers. Now that engagement is wider. Um, we're adding sustainability to those three core tenets. We've added resilience as of late with all of the devastation we've seen of natural hazards on the grid and increased frequency of power outages. And equity has been, a driving force too over the past couple of years, and more. It's more focus area of the utilities that we're talking to and that we're working with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the list of considerations going into a
Right. It's like you add
future
on and
resource
on.
strategy keeps being added, which makes it more complex, which makes it more challenging. Although, on the good news side, is that the cost of the clean energy resources in general keeps coming down and often drops faster than even the forecast. As you know, having been with Navigant Guidehouse forecasting the future, I always felt like, you put something out there, it's not going to be right, but someone wants someone to go out there and say, yes, it's going to grow this much. But on the other hand, I think I saw something that showed every forecast on solar prices was wrong, and it always didn't actually show how quick the price was dropping. And now a similar thing is happening in general with storage, although there have been COVID, and now it's more the supply chain, trying to keep up with the demand. But it is becoming more complex. Now, you mentioned, your title is resilient. So we co authored a blog together. I looked it up, trying to remember. It was about 3 years ago, where I remember you had created a map looking at the United States, and I think it was tracking legislative activity on
Oh yeah,
microgrids. So
yeah.
have you kind of continued some of that work? And I'm wondering, do you go broader than microgrids? Of course, at AutoGrid, we're interested in DERs and particularly clean DERs. So have you continued that kind of work looking at the states? And, are there any states that someone said, what are the top three, states in the US when it comes to all of this, use of AI, DERs, microgrids, VPPs? I don't want to necessarily put you on the spot, but I'm just curious if you're continuing that kind of work.
Yeah, no, no, and please put me on the spot. I'll direct or deflect if I need to.
Yep.
The work that we did, what was it, a couple of years ago on microgrids has evolved, and we continue to do that type of research.
Hmm.
I'll say this, the term microgrid has it's been a buzzword.
Right.
When I first started at SEPA, it was just following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and there
Hmm.
was a lot of focus and attention around microgrids, and there still is in Puerto Rico. Since then, the wildfires in California. You mentioned you're dealing with the smoke now.
Right.
That was a real concern, and microgrids have continued to be developed in California for public power uh,
Safety
shutoffs.
shutoffs. Yeah.
That's right. So that has continued. We've seen more and more focus on sectionalizing parts of the grid and increasing the grid's ability to ride through an event or adapt from an event to continue having power and focusing on the critical infrastructure that we have. So at SEPA, we've continued that work, but instead of focusing just on microgrids, we've expanded out to resilience and grid resilience. And it may not just be microgrids. Microgrids are just one tool. Traditional resilience investments like vegetation management and undergrounding are still strategies that utilities continue to take, both because of the cost effectiveness of the strategies and the effectiveness from a resilience standpoint. But the more I'll say non-traditional resilient solutions still remain, and microgrid development is one of those. DER, distributed energy resources, whether it's local generation or storage at a customer site, those two are also things that can be dispatched in a way to provide resilience. So we've continued that. I think you mentioned a map. I can share a few maps with you offline or to our viewership. But there still continues to be microgrid development, both from a regulatory and legislative. And I can go into some examples if you'd like.
Well, I was just thinking more, if someone said, what are the three most interesting states for DER related innovation? And I want to get to other buzzwords like DERMS, there's a whole category, and we've been doing some blogs trying to define, there is a definition of a microgrid, but as you know, even within that definition, there are people arguing, is that really a microgrid? And, there's advanced microgrids and grid interactive microgrids or grid interactive buildings. But what are if I ask you the top three states for sort of utility innovation around DERs, what three come to mind for you?
Well, I'll just, we were talking earlier. My home state of Virginia is top of mind. The
Hmm.
Virginia Clean Energy Act came out a couple years ago, and they've been coming out with new versions of it, enacting the utilities in Virginia to develop certain mandates for energy storage and renewable energy. So I think that's a big deal because the legislation is driving utilities to deploy more energy storage and solar resources. At first, the energy storage resources were more front of the meter, larger scale. And I think I recently saw that they're going to be calling for 10% of the energy storage deployments to be behind the meter.
Okay.
And that what that gets into is more of the grid interactive, behind the meter. These are resources that are smaller, but when aggregated, can really be dispatched and deployed for greater benefit than just a behind the meter resource. So you
Right.
mentioned virtual power plants. So in Virginia, I suspect as uh, that goal, as the utilities begin to deploy on that goal, we'll have both front of the meter and behind the meter resources. For those behind the meter resources, behind the meter, smaller, we're talking about the Tesla power walls, or enter your different auto grid potentially. Those are the resources that can be aggregated by a central control system operated by a utility and either indirectly or directly dispatched, controlled, managed for both customer needs and grid needs. So that's really where I personally get excited when you have that sort of control system in place. And people have been calling those virtual power plants. In essence, it makes sense. You're aggregating resources and dispatching it like you would a power plant. You're just doing it virtually, and you're doing it at different nodes closer to the customer's meter. On the flip side, you have to have a software system in place. And you mentioned DERMS. I mean, that's another buzzword we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Distributed energy resource management systems. But what those are doing are pulling those resources together and dispatching them. They're dispatching virtual power plants. They're the bones and the brains of the orchestration of all those DERs. So it's important. I think if you were to ask, a utility engineer, they would probably be telling you that utilities have been doing this for a very long time. They have distribution management systems. Even some have automated or advanced distribution management systems. DERMS is just that next step in the evolution.
Right. There's the ADMS, advanced. There's all these alphabet
Yeah, is
acronyms,
that enough
which,
buzzwords for you?
yeah, I know. And, we've been actually trying to delineate a little bit between them. And then some people say it doesn't matter. Other people say, well, we want to know what you're talking about. But, I think what's with the latest sort of vision of DERMS, at least at AutoGrid, you mentioned AI, and this critical piece. You also mentioned the market becoming more complex. It's true because now you have front of the meter assets, behind the meter assets. How do you kind of orchestrate all of that? And then you have, policy changes, even FERC Order 2222, which actually says a resource as small as 100 kilowatts, theoretically aggregated, can actually, serve a wholesale market, which would have been unheard of, 20 years ago. Where, when solar, I remember when I started, there was so little solar on the system, distributed solar, that utilities just ignored it. It was so much, it was so little that it didn't, you didn't even plan on it. And now that's totally flipped. But sticking with DERMS, I think now what the vision is, at least one vision we've been talking about, is the ability from the control room all the way down to the connected device. Um, I mean, that's sort of the vision. Is that where you think utilities all want to go, to that, having that kind of a comprehensive system? Obviously, some of those resources they will not own. That's the other thing that's different, is a lot of these, and that's like the VPP model. It's sort of like Uber or Airbnb. It's more about the value is how you control all these things and deliver in real time, what the grid needs. So are utilities looking for this kind of, I know Schneider Electric's called it grid to prosumer kind of vision of the
Mhm.
future. Do you see that that's where utilities want to go?
Yeah, like I mean, like I said, the utilities that I'm talking to and that are coming to SEPA are definitely going into that direction. I think that renewable energy resources and decarbonization strategies are a centerpiece of many of the utilities that we work with, and they are, especially the distribution utilities, are exploring how their system is changing, not only from the bones of the infrastructure of the poles and the wires, but the brains. And yeah, advanced distribution management systems are one way. Tying your outage management systems together with your advanced distribution management systems. I think I don't know the stat, but I know that a lot, a majority of utilities have deployed advanced metering infrastructure, which means a lot of the utilities have 15-minute interval on loads,
Mm-hmm.
and they're starting to deploy more transparent and visible ways to do interconnection. So what that means is where there are DERs on their system, they are more aware. So if they can be more aware, if that data can be more granular, then those are all inputs that are being fed into their planning, their operations. So without a doubt, they're going to be leaning on vendors and technology providers um, that provide these services, and that's one of the exciting things about RE Plus. And where utilities come, technology providers, you have vendors, you have the expo hall. I mean, they're going there to have conversations that they aren't typically having, and they're looking for solutions. They're looking for new software that might be their next advanced distribution management system, or their next advanced metering infrastructure or radial network. I mean, those that has been the focus of the utilities that come to SEPA, really just getting more visibility on their grid. And whether it's direct control of resources or indirect control, like you said, some utilities aren't able to own. But that doesn't mean there can be operating agreements between customers and utilities and third parties, tariffs that involve the exchange of energy and services and credits. They're starting to we're starting to see more and more of those operating agreements coming online with utilities that aren't necessarily able to own, but are partnering with third parties and customers, so that there is that arrangement where when the resource is needed for the customer, it's being dispatched for the customer. But times where the resource is not needed for the customer and can be aggregated and deployed on the grid, there's room for that. So that's really where we start to see more and more value. It's not just behind the meter energy savings. We can we can
Right.
extract more.
Right. And I think that's also one reason why utilities have become more open to some of these, I guess you could say, newer sort of approaches to delivering electricity. I remember my first microgrid report, which was in 2009, interviewing utilities, which at the time I would say they weren't very enthusiastic in general about microgrids. It was kind of like we don't know where they're going to pop up. We a lot of them were most of them were third party. There are parts, and that's what's changed is you used to go to a microgrid conference and there was no panel with utilities. Now every microgrid conference you go to, there's a utility panel and you're learning about all the issues utilities face, which are some regulatory issues. But I did want to come back to RE plus as we wrap up here. So you mentioned already what's going on there. Is there anything else that you're really excited about the upcoming event? I mean, we're talking about all these trends, obviously, a trade show. Any presentations or anything? Will you be presenting at RE Plus or some
I
of those?
will be. Yeah, I've got it. I'm on a panel with representatives from ComEd, Duke Energy, EDP Renewables. I might be forgetting one or two, but we're going to be talking about valuing resilience and how utilities and technology providers are starting to do that, which is exciting.
Interesting. Yeah, well, that's a great talk about a can of worms. I shouldn't
Yeah.
call it that way, but the value of resilience. I remember going to a conference 3 or 4 years ago where everyone's going, what we need is a value for resilience because, the irony is microgrids, the main, or not just microgrids, you say, but, the resilience a microgrid provides, there's really no public, or there haven't been. I think that's starting to change. Like, is there an adder for resilience? And what I was always talking about when I was still with Guidehouse is the people that do have an internal value are more the commercial and industrial customers because they know, let's say in California, there was the one year I think we had 3 or 4 public safety power shutoffs. They knew how much money they lost, when the grid was down. So they could sort of factor in what was the value of resilience for them. So that's an interesting topic. I think my view, the challenge on that is not making it so complicated that it takes, 5 years to come up with a value that everyone's going to argue about, but it isn't zero. So, I mean, I don't know. Someone else is going to figure that out, not me, but that's a
Yeah,
great
and
topic.
I don't think we'll have the value of resilience by the end of that session.
No, I don't
But,
think
but
it
we're
will.
certainly going to hear from. I think Duke recently did a value of DER study, and they're starting to implement that into their rate structure.
Cool.
And ComEd is also doing something similar. So we'll hear. We can
Yep.
definitely
Yeah.
I'm really excited about there's a microgrid on the show floor. I'm always jazzed up about that. It's really
Because
cool.
you're an engineer, you can't help yourself.
Yeah, no, and they instead of a ribbon cutting, they have a plug pulling, which is always good fun. But I think I feel lucky to be representing SEPA because SEPA is unique. I think to the industry, we don't we're not there advocating on a particular contingency. Our membership is broad, just like the audience and attendees at RE Plus. We are hoping that we'll drive utility attendance, but we also are focusing on those companies like AutoGrid and Schneider and other technology provider members. We have a bunch of those, and like I said earlier, like the acceleration of our industry is dependent on those types of companies. And when you get everybody around in a table, we feel that that's where progress can be accelerated. So that's where SEPA's kind of role comes into play. And I'm excited to play that out in Vegas in a couple of weeks because that's what we do it, right?
Now, I shouldn't ask you. Are you going to be gambling there? No, I'm just kidding. But anyways, no. Well, thanks so much, Jared. And I wish I could be there in Vegas with you folks. But I was there last year at a Schneider event, so it's the first time I'd been in Vegas in a long time. So that was kind of fun. Um,
Well, look,
but
I mean, there's going to be 30,000 people of our latest count, and they're going to be there to do business. They're going to be there to have conversations with one another. And
yeah,
I don't know, it's nice doing business while you can also save the world, right?
That's well, no, but that's a great way of saying because that's what I said when I got into renewable energy. I remember when people say, "Oh, you're a writer. What do you write about?" And you go energy, and about 20 years ago, people go, "Oh man, that sounds kind of dry." But then, well, we had the power, the Enron, debacle in California, and that's when I think when we started having power outages, sadly enough, or not maybe sadly, but people started paying more attention. And now, I mean, I just installed a solar battery system, so and I want to become part of the VPP. So it is pretty cool to go on your phone and say, "Oh, today I was, 87% self-powered, and I'm sending power back to the grid." So I think all that is making it more understandable for the average citizen. Whereas in the past, as you know, you flipped a switch, you assumed it was always there, and you really didn't know where your power was coming from. So we've come a long way.
I'm
So,
almost there. I'm getting there. I got to get on my local utility, Rocky Mountain Power. They've got a few programs I'm looking into. So,
all right, cool. All right, Jared. Well, thanks so much for joining us on the Grid Edge, and have fun in Vegas.
thank you very
Okay.
much.